The 3 years since my mum's death had felt like an endless void. I was 19, but I still remembered her smile. The warmth of her touch. People say life goes on, but for me time had frozen that day. It all started like any other until my dad casually dropped the phrase, "We're having guests for dinner tonight." That one sentence replaced the usual monotony. That evening I realized that my dad had been hiding something. That night I realized my dad had been hiding more than I thought. He introduced Rebecca, a woman he'd met and was apparently planning to marry, but the real shock came when I saw the guy standing next to her, Henry, tall, with dark brown eyes and standing there with this effortless confidence. It wasn't just the simple reaction. I felt this unexplainable tightness in my chest, even when he glanced at me briefly and then looked away. The turmoil inside me only grew as we sat around the table for dinner. Dad. Henry's silence hung over the table like a wall between us. The only real sound was the clinking of forks against plates. At one point our eyes met. It only lasted a second or two, but my heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I quickly looked away, but there was no escape. But there was no escaping how I felt. After dinner, Dad called us all into the living room. He had this big announcement vibe. "We need a fresh start." He said, "We're moving to a bigger house upstairs. Henry and Charlotte will have their own rooms. Rebecca and I will stay downstairs." Rebecca smiled. Henry nodded warmly, like it was no big deal, but I was a mess inside. The thought of living under the same roof as Henry was already overwhelming, and now we'd be on the same floor. My emotions were all over the place. Was it excitement and anxiety? Maybe a mixture of both? 3 months had passed. Life in the new house was different from what I'd expected. During the day we acted like a normal family. Rebecca cooked in the kitchen, Dad read his newspapers, and Henry and I kept our distance most of the time. But there were moments when it felt like that distance was melting away. I kept telling myself he was your stepbrother, but those words never seemed convincing enough. My 20th birthday was coming up. Rebecca and Dad had mentioned planning a little celebration, but I had no idea what. Henry had been thinking about it lately. Things had been weird. Talking to him left me with a strange restlessness. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me for just a little too long, and when our eyes met it felt like something inside me was breaking apart. One night, while everyone else was asleep, I walked past Henry's room. His door was slightly open. And he was sitting at his desk working. I tried not to look, but before I could walk away he looked up. "Is everything okay?" he asked. I just shook my head and walked back to my room. But after that night things were never the same again. The day before my birthday, Dad and Rebecca told me they were going abroad for 3 days for one of his jobs. "We'll make it up to you as soon as we get back, I promise," he said. Rebecca smiled in agreement and backed him up. But at that moment, while Dad was talking, my eyes drifted to Henry. At me in a way I'd never seen before. The usual coldness in his eyes had gone. Instead he seemed pleased, almost happy about this turn of events, and his look gave him away. It was as if he'd just realized something about me, something that even I was still finding out. Maybe he'd noticed that I liked him. I went into the kitchen to make some snacks. Henry sat quietly in the living room, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. It made me feel uncomfortable yet strangely excited. I thought about sitting next to him, but instead I decided to sit next to him. "I'm thinking of inviting a few friends over tomorrow for my birthday," I said, sneaking a glance at him. Henry gave a small smile. "Sounds like a great idea," he said, but there was something about the calmness in his voice. It felt like he was holding back, much more than he let on. When the day came, I started to get things ready as the sun began to set. Once I'd finished setting up, I went upstairs to get ready. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I felt a different kind of excitement bubbling up inside of me, my blonde wavy hair falling loose over my shoulders. As I was getting ready, I noticed that Henry had dressed up too. He was wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows and black trousers. He looked so handsome that my heart leapt. I'd never really noticed how handsome he was until that moment, but what really got me was the way he looked at me. His gaze lingered and I could feel his eyes roaming over me. It wasn't subtle, it was deliberate. He'd never looked at me like that before. there was admiration in his eyes, even a hint of admiration. There was admiration in his eyes, even a hint of something deeper. Did he like me? The thought echoed in my mind, and as I tried to escape his gaze, our eyes locked. There was no escaping it. The party was in full swing, my friends were laughing, the music was loud, and the energy in the room was electric. But no matter what, my attention kept returning to Henry. He was standing off to the side, away from the crowd, his hands in his pockets, just watching me, his quiet presence pulling at me in a way I couldn't explain. At one point I finally worked up the courage to talk to him. You know, you could join in the fun, I said half-jokingly as I approached him. That familiar look came back into his eyes. He smiled slightly and said, "If tonight is any fun, it's because of you." Those words hit me like a spark, igniting something inside me as the party went on. I felt like his gaze made me feel taller, bolder, more seductive, but at the same time it was pulling me into this whirlwind of emotions. Into this whirlwind of emotions that I couldn't control. The unspoken tension between us grew by the second, becoming something that neither of us could ignore. When the party ended, the house had gone quiet as the last of my friends left. I noticed Henry in the kitchen gathering glasses as I turned my head. "It's your birthday, Charlotte," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it before. "The night shouldn't end just yet. I've got a surprise for you." He opened the fridge and grabbed a bottle of beer, uncapping it and handing it to me. As I watched him act so relaxed, I couldn't help but smile. Henry walked into the living room, grabbed the remote and put on a romantic film. "I want you to watch this," he said, turning off the lights. We sat side by side on the sofa. There wasn't much space between us, but even that little gap was enough to make my nerves crack. He looked calm, but the slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips made me uneasy. As the film progressed, a romantic scene came up. My heart began to race. I was suddenly hyper-aware of every breath I took, afraid he might hear me. I put down the beer bottle and tried to steady myself, and then, without meaning to, I looked at him. As our eyes met, something in his gaze changed, and I knew at that moment there was no going back. In the silence, Henry suddenly placed his hand gently on my thigh. I froze. I was shocked, but I couldn't move as he leaned in and kissed me. At first I just sat there stunned, but then I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't deny the warmth of his touch, the way he made me feel at that moment. My heart was pounding, my mind was spinning, but my body kept responding to him. It all felt so natural, so inevitable, that I did nothing to stop it. That night, for the rest of the night, I didn't know what to do. That night, for the first time in my life, I experienced something I'd never felt before. In the darkness of the room, it was just the two of us, and the rest of the world disappeared. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in bed next to Henry. This wasn't my room, it was Rebecca and Dad's bedroom. I turned my head and saw Henry's face. Even in his sleep he looked peaceful, but inside me a storm was raging as the memories of last night came flooding back. I felt a mixture of excitement and guilt. We had crossed the line we could never cross. This wasn't just some innocent misunderstanding, it was the start of something complicated. Something new for both of us, but as the morning light filtered through the curtains, I had no idea how much my life was about to change. That morning, everything was quiet, but I couldn't silence the chaos in my head. Henry was still asleep, his face calm and green as I watched him. I slipped out of bed quietly and hurried back to my room. In the cold of the morning I stood under the hot shower, wishing I could wash away everything that had happened last night, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get his eyes, his touch, or the way I felt out of my head. Life seemed normal on the surface: family breakfasts, casual chats at dinner, laughter around the table, but every moment I felt like I was living in a parallel world because of the secret Henry and I shared whenever our eyes met. Henry tried to pretend that everything was fine, but every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of tension in his face. Did Dad suspect something? Rebecca picked up on something. I felt like I was drowning in my own guilt every time I looked at her. The weight of the secret we were hiding was unbearable. A year later I moved out of the house where I'd always felt like an outsider, even before all this started. Again in a new city I try to rebuild my life, but every night when I lie in bed the memories of that night whisper to me from the corners of my mind. Some secrets can never be forgotten, you just learn to live with them. If you have listened to my story so far, it means you like it and we are closer now. Trust. If you want to join me for more secrets and stories, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, that way you won't miss anything. See you soon.